Now, as I told you last week, read the textbook before you come to class, then you know what I will be talking about. Because this hour, I'm essentially going to be talking about one monument in quite a lot of detail. Oh, good. Unlike the reign of Marcus Aurelius, now, the reign of Antoninus Pius was essentially a pretty peaceful one. There was only one major war that we know of, and that was in North Britain against a group of people who were not called the Scots. The Scots did not arrive in Scotland until the 7th century. They were called the Picts, meaning the painted people. That was the only major war that we know of in any detail during the reign of Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius is one of those emperors who, there are biographies of him, Roman biographies, but nobody's really subjected him to modern analysis. So, but basically there was not a lot of activity, military activity. But immediately after Antoninus died, the Parthians invaded Armenia. Armenia, a Roman ally, and as I pointed out before, classical Armenia, east of the Euphrates, was one of those buffer states. Whoever controlled classical Armenia could invade the Roman Empire, Cappadocia, or could invade Parthia. Technically a Roman ally, but the Parthians took advantage of the death of Antoninus Pius to try and capture it. A Roman legion left Cappadocia and was destroyed in battle somewhere to the east of the Euphrates. It was probably the 9th legion, but we can't be absolutely certain. So Verus and several of the legions were sent from the Danubian provinces to the east to deal with this particular event. As it was basically Verus' senior generals who really dealt with the war. Lucius Verus spent most of his time in Antioch, enjoying the water there. Antioch, just outside Antioch, a place called Daphne, a very popular suburb in the Roman period. The war was eventually brought to a successful end in 166, after which the Danubian legions returned to Europe, and so did Verus, bringing with them some kind of disease. It may have been smallpox, it may have been a form of influenza, it may have been measles. We don't know what it was. But whatever it was, they brought with them some infection, the result being a pandemic, an illness that spread throughout the Roman Empire, in which it's been estimated, judging from the reports from Rome, that perhaps as many as 5 million people died. Among them, Lucius Verus. This illness continued to come back, kept on sort of reigniting itself. Lucius Verus dies in 169. Well, I said I was going to talk about one monument. I'm actually going to talk about two, because the first one I want to talk about is this one here, which is hardly discussed in the textbook at all. This is what we know as the Parthian altar. It was a monument that was built somewhere in Ephesus, we don't know exactly where, to commemorate the Parthian War of Lucius Verus. It was built after Lucius Verus died, because there is an apotheosis scene of Lucius Verus on this. The basic monument itself was designed after the great altar of Pergamum. It's a U-shaped altar with a 2-meter high frieze going around it. The total length of the frieze approximately 31 meters. For a long time, and I think the textbook mentions this, there was some argument as to whether or not this represented an event in Hadrian's reign, the adoption of Antoninus Pius or something like that. But in 1978, a head was found at Ephesus that belongs to this frieze, and it's clearly Lucius Verus. Remember the moustache and beard. So there's no doubt about its late Antonine date. Sometime in the 4th or 5th century, this altar was demolished. Parts of it were reused to build a fountain outside the library of Celsus at Ephesus. So we don't know where the original altar was. We don't actually have all the complete bits and pieces of frieze. But we're fortunate in that most of the surviving panels, although some of them are badly damaged, are marked with Greek letters that indicate where they come in the sequence. So we can work out a kind of story. So we can work out that this was probably a narrative frieze. It starts with a beginning and goes to a logical end. We have some scenes clearly represent the achievements of the Antonine dynasty. And as we will see, it starts off probably with a frieze of Hadrian handing power to Antoninus Pius. It's a work of propaganda. It was there to remind people of the emperor's personal involvement in protecting the people of the Roman Empire. Most of this was excavated, by the way, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So if you ever get a chance to go to Vienna, go and look at it. There are about 3 pieces and a couple of plaster copies in the museum at Ephesus. Well, the frieze, as you would expect, commemorates a war, so you've got a whole series of standard battle-type friezes. And I apologise for the quality of these. The actual carvings are a lot better, not helped by the fact that they've got these bright spotlights going down on it. So they're relatively stereotype battle scenes. You know, you can see the Hellenistic background to this, and you can see how the idea for this would come from the Gigantomachy on the great altar of Zeus. An interesting thing is that you can't, you know, there's a hint of this Hellenistic Baroque. We'll be looking at this guy in them there. We can't always tell who is who is losing, who is winning. Well, this looks like a rather conventionalized barbarian with a big long beard, but if this is meant to represent the Parthian War of Lucius Verus, then you shouldn't have that type of thing there. So you can see this, you know, this barbarian looks more like a northern barbarian than an eastern barbarian. There is, you know, a great hint of Hellenistic Baroque in this, but it goes into that normal Hellenistic Greek style. There are 1 or 2 panels in which you do have representations of Roman armour. This is clearly a Roman general. He's wearing his standard all-piece bronze cuirass with the ptergs hanging out. You can see his tunic there. He's wearing trousers in this particular case. But if you look at this warrior here, I mean, that doesn't look like a Roman warrior. It looks more like an Amazonian or a Greek. But this is obviously a warrior on the winning side, because there's the enemy down there. So it is rather generic in that sense. It's Hellenistic. It's only because you get the odd figure like this that you know this is meant to represent some kind of Roman war. It's not allegorical. It is kind of Roman Verus. Wearing these loincloths, I mean, who would go around wearing loincloths? You know, it's not the northern barbarians, not the Parthians. It is very generic in that sense. But then you've got this one scene, which is an apotheosis scene. It's an apotheosis scene with a difference. There is only one parallel for this particular scene, and unfortunately I couldn't find a photograph of it. And this is on something called the Belvedere altar. It's an Augustan work which shows the apotheosis of Julius Caesar. In that particular thing, Julius Caesar is shown stepping into a chariot to rise up towards Helios, the sun god. Well, this is what we've got here. We've got a Roman general stepping into a 2-horse chariot, but this is clearly apotheosis because you can just make out little stars there, the spikes. This is the sun god, Helios. So this is not representing a general being met by gods. The horses are rising up into the air. Victory is helping the general into the chariot. And you've got a female figure here down here, might be Tellus, Mother Earth, who's holding a cornucopia. So the apotheosis of Lucius Verus. The really remarkable particular scene in this, though, is this one, the imperial figures scene. What we see in late antiquity is very much full frontal, Constantine, that sort of thing, people facing out at you. In early Roman relief art, you tend to see three-quarter or full profile. But in the Antonine altar, we're going towards a frontal aspect. Here we've got a group of, well, there's 5 figures actually, but ignore that one over there. That one's not important, meaning we don't know who it is. You've got 2 mature men here, both with beards. They are both velatus. So they've got their toga pulled partly over their head. They are celebrating a sacrifice, or they're about to take part in a sacrifice. There are 2 young men with them, or rather 1 young man and 1 boy down here. Well, you can see the distinct age difference between these 2. It's very easy to identify who these must represent. Hadrian, rather round face, or well, actually that might be Hadrian, Antoninus Pius. It's got to be those 2. You can't tell exactly quite who is who, although that one's taller, so that could be Hadrian there. This is Marcus Aurelius. That's Lucius Commodus, as he was when he was adopted. Remember, he is 10 or 11 when he's adopted. He's 15, 16, 17. So what we can see in the Antonine frieze and the Parthian altar at Ephesus is one of these great dynastic works of propaganda, linking all the family together. It probably starts, the frieze probably starts with this type of celebration. There is another fragment that shows a sacrifice that must be the next one going on from here. And then you must have some report of Antoninus Pius and perhaps Faustina. Then, of course, Marcus Aurelius, the Lucius Verus campaign against the Parthians, and then the apotheosis ceremony of Lucius Verus at the end of that. So you've got a very distinctive piece of work here. And remember, it's this vital aspect. This is the first time really we see this frontal approach. It's going to become more and more common. It happens before, but here it's very, very obvious. Well, Verus, as I said, died in 169, and while Verus was dealing with the wars in the east, Marcus Aurelius was dealing with a whole series of small-scale attacks and invasions in Europe. You get groups of people, the Quadi, the Marcomanni. These are tribes who live roughly in what is now Austria, to the north of the Danube, Germany to the north of the Danube. And you've got the Sarmatians, who live in what is roughly modern Hungary. And like the Parthians, they take advantage of the death of Antoninus Pius to try and make an impact on Rome. Not quite so serious an attack and invasion as the Parthian one, but already starting in 161, 162, 163, small-scale attacks. By 169, the Marcomanni, probably, we can't be certain exactly who, had crossed the Alps, had crossed the Tyrol, and entered North Italy. 2 major defeats suffered by Marcus Aurelius at that time. Slowly but surely, Marcus Aurelius starts to deal with these campaigns, and there is a lot of problems with the chronology of exactly what goes on. It's at the same time he's dealing with these campaigns, he's sitting at a place called Carnuntum, which is basically where he starts writing his meditations, in Greek, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, of course. The meditations frequently refer to the stupidity of war, to the horrors of war. And we will see a reflection of this when we look at the Aurelian column tomorrow. Well, we know that he had a series of campaigns against the Quadi and the Marcomanni that came to an end roughly about 173. Then he fought with the Sarmatians, defeated them in about 175. He then became ill with the same illness that Lucius Verus' soldiers had brought back. Smallpox, pig flu, bird flu, measles, we don't know what it is. A rumour spread that he'd actually died, and the governor of Syria, a man who was born in Lycia, modern Turkey, declared himself emperor, and then 100 days later found out, whoops, the emperor's still alive. But it started a small-scale civil war, which allowed the Germanic tribes, the Sarmatians in particular, but also the Marcomanni, to cross the Danube and threaten Italy again. So Marcus Aurelius has to go back and deal with this, and between 175 and 176, 177, there's problems with the chronology, eventually won a final decisive victory against these tribes, and he was awarded a triumph. This triumph may have been the reason for the creation of the Campiolo bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, the only surviving complete example of a Roman bronze equestrian statue. From literary sources, we know there were more bronze statues of emperors and several other bronze equestrian statues of emperors in Rome, but bronze can be melted down and reused to make cannon, coins, all sorts of things, church bells. So, we're very lucky that this particular one survived. This particular one only survived because the people of Rome thought it was Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Now, why they thought it was Constantine, I've got absolutely no idea. Constantine pretty clearly does not have a long curly beard, and he doesn't have lots of curly hair, but the people of Rome thought it represented Constantine. Other than that, all we know about it is that in 1546 or 1547, that terrible person called Michelangelo, who completely ruined so much of classical Rome, decided he wanted this to be the centerpiece of his new square that he laid out for the Parliament and the Senate House of Rome, the Campiolo Square. This is all now the Capitoline Museum. He designed this incredible pavement here. The photographs I've got of it are not terribly good, but this is Michelangelo's design, completed after his death, with the buildings, the equestrian statue in the centre there, so you've got the view of looking down at it there, this enormous staircase that comes up. If you ever go here, look on that side, because the remains of a Roman apartment block, 4-storey high Roman apartment block. Everybody walks past it. I think, oh, got to go and see the bronze statue. In 1981, it stayed there until 1981 when it was removed, and they suddenly became a little bit worried that the corrosive atmosphere might destroy it. It was placed in the building on the right-hand side, and there is now a replica, and this is the spot to have your wedding photographs taken if in Rome on a suitable day. And this is the replica, and you can recognise the replica because it's just a bronze colour, unlike the original, which has still got traces of the original gilding on it. Well, this is really a superb monument. Did I say one monument? I'm talking about 3 monuments in this hour. This is really one of the most amazing monuments. It's one of those monuments that gives you a bit of a shake when you go to see it. It's 3.5 metres high, originally completely gilded. You can see those stirrups, because Romans didn't have stirrup. This is a Turkic invention. Romans have a high saddle at the front and the back. You can see the saddle cloth there. He's got his arm outstretched. Now, is this ad locutio, he's making a speech, or is this clementia? He's being merciful to people. It's a bit difficult to know. I mean, if it was straight up like that, it would be ad locutio, a speech. If it's exactly horizontal, it would be clementia. I'll explain these terms in the next set of slides. So it looked a bit more clementia. light than anything else. Now, this, as I said, we can't be certain this does belong to the Triumph celebrations, but it does fit in to that particular point. The whole thing is incredibly well detailed, beautifully made. Equestrian statue, it's very difficult to mount a heavy piece of bronze, a statue of a horse, on 3 legs like this because of the weight. So it's very carefully made. Several sections, of course. Beautiful detailing of the horse, those lovely sort of lines around the neck there. Marvellous detailing of the shoes of the emperor, as you can see here, with the ties up laces there as well. And of course the face of Marcus Aurelius, that sort of, it's raining again. Type of, well, if it's not raining right now, it will rain a bit later. So we can be certain it's Marcus Aurelius. It's a very interesting portrait, this though, because whether ad locutio or whether Clementio, now I'll explain these terms in a moment in more detail, but this is the military statue. This is the Emperor Victorious. Doesn't look entirely happy though. You see here the face of the man who writes the meditations in Carnuntum during this particular period. He's reflecting on what was probably his real desire in life, to be a philosopher. Rather like Prince Charles in England, he'd been sitting around for years waiting for Antoninus Pius to die. Prince Charles in England had been sitting around for 58 years actually, since his mum became, no, 60 years since his mum became queen, waiting for his mum to die. Well, he had to wait a long time. He had to wait 23 years for that. So, doesn't look terribly happy at all. The literary sources do tell us that the victory over the Germans was celebrated by a triumph with a victory arch and a column. And this is why we come to this. The triumphal arch doesn't survive. The column does. I'll talk about that in the next class. But we're fortunate in that 11 of what were probably 12 of the original carved panels from the arch have survived. We know these as the panel reliefs of Marcus Aurelius. 3 of them were found on the Capitoline Hill. The other 8 were found reused in the Arch of Constantine, which was built in the year 312. The Arch of Constantine, of course, has got the Trajanic Dacian figures, the Trajanic frieze, the Hadrianic tondi, and the relief panels of Marcus Aurelius. And this diagram says what is what. There isn't very much Constantinian work in this actual structure, but here we have in yellow the panel reliefs, and this is a long shot view of what you can see on one side. We'll come back to these in a moment. Here's the other side. Now, as you can see, just like with the great Trajanic frieze, the face of the emperor has been recarved to make it look like Constantine. So, but for a long time people said, these can't be Constantinian, because the style of the armour is not Constantinian. The style of the beards is not Constantinian. But it wasn't until they actually found these 3 panels on the Capitoline Hill that they could identify it as coming from, presumably, probably, we don't know, this Arch of Marcus Aurelius. The 3 found on the Capitoline Hill were never recarved. So, and you can see when you look at this more closely, see how Constantine's head, a little bit small for the body? Right size there. See this guy here? This is almost certainly Pompeianus, the son-in-law of Marcus Aurelius, his senior advisor, his senior general. Well, he's been recarved to look more like a 4th century person there. Why these are significant and why I'm devoting some time to this is because we've already seen how Roman imperial art developed a very distinctive language, a series of themes, positions for representing imperial authority, as with, for example, these, which of course you will know very well, the prima porta statue of Augustus, the imperator, the commander-in-chief, the victorious general, the Via Labicana Augusta, the priest, Pontifex Maximus, the father of his people. These have got definite messages behind them. This aspect of Roman art, in which the emperor is shown in one or another set particular pose or surroundings to show his role in Roman society, is repeated throughout Roman art. We see it in Roman art, in coins, we see it in relief friezes, we see it in statues, we see it on triumphal arches, we see it on columns. The thing about the panel reliefs of Marcus Aurelius is that we've got an almost complete set. We are missing probably exactly one. A complete set of reliefs that give us the iconography, if you like, of how a good Roman emperor should be represented. Iconography. A series of set poses, each of which has got a specific message within the group as a whole. Now, like I said, we don't know if they came from a triumphal arch. We think they did. Some people believe that they came from a single arch, would have looked something like Trajan's Arch at Beneventum. Some people think they might have come from two arches. Well, you can see you've got 12 altogether. You could get 6 on each side. We don't have any letters on them to indicate where they come in a sequence, but we can build up a sequence. Now, the sequence I'm giving you is the sequence I think best fits, and which allows us to identify the missing panel as being the emperor as imperator. Well, let's look at these. The first one, for the sake of argument, is the Profectio scene. This is the departure of an emperor for a military campaign. We've seen this, Chancellaria relief. We've got various standard elements in this. We've got the old man with the beard and the toga, representing the genius, the spirit of the Roman Senate. Well, this is one of those that's been recarved to represent Constantine. But just behind you can see that man with the large nose. He featured in almost all of these. This is Pompeianus, the son-in-law of Marcus Aurelius and senior advisor in general. He's going from a gate. This is almost certainly going to be the gate we know as the Porta Flamina. The Via Flamina is the road that goes north from Rome towards the Rhine and the Danube. So that's the most obvious route he would take. And in fact, down here we have this female figure leaning against a wheel. So she's the personification of a road. She represents the Via Flamina. Next in the sequence is the Lustratio. This is the sacrifice to the gods. Now, this sacrifice is on a temporary altar, a tripod altar. The emperor is surrounded by soldiers, so this shows us he's somewhere near the battlefront. What the Lustratio scene here, the purification, ritual sacrifice, indicates on one part, pietatis, the emperor's respect for the gods. But it's also the emperor as Pontifex Maximus. The emperor is the chief priest of Rome. He is the person who acts as the intermediary between the Roman people and the gods. So he's making the sacrifice on behalf of the Roman people. This is the message that's involved in this. Again, you've got sort of good Roman soldiers standing around here. Poor little pig doesn't look too happy. Going to be bacon there for dinner tonight, or roast pork for dinner, or something like that. A third panel, what I would reconstruct as the third panel, is clearly an adlocutio. Now, it's an adlocutio with a bit of a difference because the arm is bent. Normally, ad locutio, the arm is out. But remember this from prima porta? Leaning back on one leg. Well, when you make a long speech, and you do a lot of this, otherwise you get varicose veins, which is what common complaint of most teachers. No, I'm all right at the moment, thank you. Nice representations of Roman soldiers in armour of the time, scale armour and hoop armour, a rather plain background. Now, notice these backgrounds do vary. Sometimes they're very full, like this one with the Porta Flamina. Sometimes they're rather plain. And some people would identify two different sculptors at work in making these panels. Justitia, justice. Well, the emperor is the source of all law and justice in the Roman world. The emperor makes judgments. He's the final court of appeal if a Roman citizen is convicted of something. So the emperor here sitting on a sella curalis. This is a particular type of folding seat that was used by magistrates. There were no permanent seats in the Roman Senate house. You took your folding seat along and sat on it. The sella curalis is the seat of the magistrate. He's on the high podium, which is of course what we always associate with judges making announcements. Anything he says from that particular position is said to be ex cathedra, from the chair, which is where we get the word cathedral from, the seat of the bishop. Well, this is the emperor showing justice. The Romans always liked to think of themselves as bringing civilization, and law and order to the barbarian peoples of the world. And one of the significant features of civilization is justice, equal law for everybody. So what we've got here is the emperor, disguised as Constantine. There's Pompeianus, there you've got your Roman soldiers. You've got a barbarian, long beard, tunic, belted trousers, holding on to his son who's bent over, something like this. This is a barbarian who's pleading before the emperor, a barbarian, not a Roman citizen, pleading before the emperor for justice. Presumably, this is his son, some crime against his son. So this is the emperor bringing law and order to barbarian peoples. But of course, for a Roman seeing this in Rome, it symbolises this fact. The emperor is the source of all law and order. The next one must be the missing one, which must be a battle scene. The emperor as imperator, the victorious general and his troops, because the rest all fit into a sequence quite happily. You can move Justitia back and forth, but you can't move these back and forth very much. This one, as you can see, is zoom lens shot, where you've got a barbarian chieftain here. He's in chains, he's being dragged before the emperor. This must represent, hang on, I've got them back in front, yeah. No, that's all right. Well, I'll carry on in that particular way anyway. He's being dragged before the emperor. The emperor's not wearing battle dress or anything like that. Changed to Constantine. Pompeianus is still round the back there, as you can see here. So these are the enemies surrendering towards him. This, of course, matches the scene on the Campiolo statue. The Emperor Clementia. Now, his arm is distinctly down in this particular case. It's not horizontal, not slightly raised. But here we have barbarians pleading for mercy. So we've got that surrender scene, the power of Rome. Rome will defeat its enemies. Two major losses in this particular war. Before that, the battle scene, the emperor in battle, fighting for the Roman people, the Roman emperor. Now we have the aftermath of the battle, the first stage. Well, the trees in the background are rather strange because they look kind of like palm trees on one side and oak trees on the other side. Olive trees on one side, oak trees the other. So you're not quite certain where it's meant to be. There's Pompeianus, of course, standing there. But this signifies the fact that Rome will always win its wars, but Rome is merciful. So in a sense, don't fight Rome, but if you do, we'll defeat you, but we won't come for vengeance. We're not like Alexander the Great in wiping out the population of whole cities just to make a particular point. Then we have this scene, which is we see often on coins, but very rarely in friezes. When Rome fought a war against somebody like Armenia or Parthia or the Sarmatians, what would often follow would be this peace ceremony. A treaty would be agreed, something like that. And then the Roman emperor would give a king to those people. Rex Datus, I give you a king. I am presenting you, my former enemy, with a king. A king, obviously, who's allied to Rome, he's still barbarian, he's still got trousers on like that. But this person will be your new king. I will support him if he has any problems. By the way, don't forget the power of Rome, all those signals standard in the background. Pompeianus, if that's who he is there. An Adventus scene, well, you've seen the Adventus scene in Chancellaria reliefs. This is the return to Rome after the victory against the barbarians. This is the only one of the panel reliefs that does not have any other human figures in it apart from the emperor. There's a bit of argument about exactly who these two are meant to represent. There's no clear attribute as who they are, but what we've got here is the same arch that we saw at the beginning, but now with a victory garland, so we're coming back into the Porta Flamina. Here's Nike, the goddess of victory, holding the garland above the head of the emperor, recarved to represent Constantine. This is Mars, the god of war. And this is Roma, the personification of Rome, welcoming him back. These two female figures, as I said, nobody's quite certain who they are. They're not obviously Vestal Virgins or anything like that. There are no male figures in this at all. There's a temple in the background, but we can't quite identify what the temple is. The pediment isn't clear enough, although it's fairly clearly a tetrastyle temple. So there are a few problems with this, but this does seem to be the only panel that just has a god and personifications in it, nothing else. Then we have this one, Liberalitas. Liberalitas, generosity. Well, what do Roman emperors do? What did the Romans ever do for us? They built us an aqueduct, they built us a market, they built us a temple, they built a road system. Amphitheatres, theatres. Roman emperors are generous to the people. People at Rome get free bread, free olive oil, almost certainly. There's some debate about that. Roman emperors give the people of Rome money to celebrate a specific occasion, like a victory or birth of a new member of the family, or something like that. Liberalitas, the emperor is generous to the people. Again, he's sitting on the Sella Curalis. This is a symbol of his authority, supreme authority as princeps. Again, we've got this slightly recarved figure around here. Now, this is a very interesting piece of work in many ways, because if you look very carefully at it, well, you can see that's been recarved. He's beautifully carved, but he's not quite right, is he? What's that little bump down there? The triumph over the Germans was celebrated in 177 by Commodus, the only surviving son of Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius giving money to the Roman people. this is what this panel showed. But after Commodus was killed and suffered damnatio memoria, they cut Commodus off. This is just the remains of what was a foot. That would have been Commodus's foot, where you wouldn't see it from down at ground level. But you see how badly carved all this is? Well, there was enough of Commodus sitting there, presumably at a lower level, to be able to allow him to be taken off and this whole thing to be recarved. Just to come back to this, of course, remember the Trajan's Arch at Beneventum? The Alimentia scene, the father carrying his children away like that. Well, there you are there. We have the triumph scene, representing the defeat of Rome's enemies. We've got this in the Arch of Titus. Well, here rather similar in a sense. We've got an archway, a temple in the background. Marcus Aurelius is in a four-horse chariot, a quadriga. The chariot is decorated with figures of Roma. I think that's Jupiter there. This is Nike, Victory up there, and you can just see she's got the remains of a wreath in one hand. Trumpets are blowing away there. Can you see something very odd about this particular scene? No, you've got to study it in great detail. Well, her hand ends in a rather strange way. Oh, and those steps don't look terribly straight. That looks rather like a big chariot for one person. Yeah. We know from literary sources that Commodus was in the chariot with Marcus Aurelius. Commodus has been taken out. You know, it's like airbrushing a photograph from the communist period in Russia. Nike would have been holding two laurel wreaths, one in each hand. That one's gone. We don't want, but they couldn't save enough stone to actually carve her hand in there. So you've got this very odd presentation there. Then we come to the last of these, the emperor making the formal sacrifice at the end of the campaign to celebrate the victory. We can recognize this as the Capitoline Temple. It's shown very schematically. It's shown with just 4 columns at the front. So there's a bit of an argument about whether it is the Capitoline Temple, but the contents of the pediments suggest to some people it is. I don't think it is. I think it's another temple altogether. I think it might be one to Mars that was on the Capitoline Hill. But anyway, I'm not an expert. But this is one of these unconverted panels. Now again, of course, we've got the familiar figures here. That's probably Pompeianus there. That little guy with a funny hat with a spike on the top. He's not a German from the First World War wearing a pickelhaube who's somehow got into this strip scene. He's one of the priests of Rome. You've got the Victimarius there about to kill the animals. Again, we've got a rather temporary altar, not a formal altar, with the emperor being shown Velatus ready to make the sacrifice. It's the Emperor's Pontifex Maximus, very clearly. He's the chief priest of the Roman people. He's the intermediary between the Roman people and the gods. So I finished with that one. I hope I didn't go on too long, but this really is one of the most important groups of monuments to see. When you get to Rome, if you ever get to Rome, look at all these bits and pieces, the 3 that are in the museum, the 8 that are still on the arch, and think about the symbolism behind them. There you are, lads and lasses, guys and girls.